What does a plastic trumpet sound like? Does it sound different?
Not as good as a metal one.
Rusty Quill presents Enthusiasm. Hello, friends and fans, and welcome to Enthusiasm. I am your host, Helen Gould, one of the best Rusty Quillers, and today we're talking about jazz, and I am very, very, very pleased to be joined by Beth, Callum, Kathy, and Sam. So I'm going to hand over and let them introduce themselves. Beth, what are your pronouns and what do you do?
Hey, yeah, I'm Beth. I am she, her. And I am a vocal coach and a YouTuber.
What's your YouTube channel about? Is it all about singing tips?
It's singing. Not all jazz, but a mix.
Do you want to plug your YouTube channel name?
It's Beth Roars. It's my name. Well, it's kind of not my name. It's my fake name.
Excellent. Callum, you're up next. What are your pronouns and what do you do?
So I'm Callum, he, him. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer for Rusty Quill, though I also do have a background in music. I've done musicals that have won the Office Awards.
Right.
And particularly that was a funk, soul, jazz, rock musical kind of thing going on there. So there's a little bit of that in there. And then a multi-instrumentalist and so on.
Really? You play multiple instruments?
Yeah. I mean, drums, guitar, flute. And you'll find today during the conversation that flute, jazz in particular, is of my key point of interest. But I kind of also play like synthesizer and like MIDI stuff on there. So arguably every other instrument via the method of cheating to just press two simple keys. Over and over again.
I had no idea that you played all those instruments. Oh, this is so exciting. All right, Kathy, what are your pronouns and what do you do?
Hi, I'm Kathy. I am she, her, and I am audio master for Rusty Quill. And honestly, I don't have any particular expertise in jazz, but I enjoy the art form and I have an interest in jazz history due to some theater stuff I did recently and just want to kind of represent the people who like jazz but don't know enough about it.
You are extremely welcome. You are on this podcast because you like a thing. And we are always in favour of people liking things, so do not worry. And Sam, please do give us your pronouns and tell us who you are and what you do.
Yeah, hi all, I'm Sam. I'm resident composer at Rusty Quill, so I take notes, stick them together and hope they work. Yeah, I guess I've been exposed to a lot of jazz. I'm not an expert at all. I did a history of jazz module, so we can talk about some facts that may or may not be correct. But I'm so glad that Callum's the fucking soul guy because that's really where my interest is, I think. I love fusion jazz. That's maybe what I can talk about a bit more. But yeah, excited to be here.
Very, very exciting. Oh, I should mention, you did the theme tune for this show as well.
I did, yes. Yeah.
After me just sending you YouTube videos like, I like this one. Can you make something that sounds a bit like that?
That's me doing weird mouth pops in that you latched onto immediately.
I was like, yes, I like the pops. Excellent. Okay, all right. So, how did you get into jazz? What was your gateway into the, I was going to say jazz universe, the uni jazz? No, there's no clever way to do it. Would anyone like to go first?
Well, I used to play saxophone. I haven't played it in years. But I think when I was a kid, I just wanted to be Lisa Simpson. And that's where it started. And I was like, Mom, I'm going to learn the saxophone. And then I had to kind of learn jazz. So, and then I was like, this is great. I love this.
The saxophone is such a lovely instrument. It's got such a, I want to describe it as like a round sound. Ooh. I don't.
Yes.
What Sam? Audience, Sam just picked up a saxophone and showed it off.
You were just started describing, so I thought, visual aid.
Well, I mean, if I was to, it's more of a squiggly sound going off the instrument itself. But yeah, I love listening to saxophones because, like, I'm into jazz because my dad was super into jazz, and he had this old record player that he'd bought when he was a student, and he would just like blast it through the house. Like, he was downstairs and my bedroom was upstairs, and I would hear whatever he was playing. Like, he would wake me up on the weekend sometimes. Anyone else want to talk about your intro to jazz?
Yeah, I had a very similar one to Beth. I actually started on clarinet, was my first instrument, and then wanted to be cooler. So around the age of 12, I did a very slow transition to saxophone by buying a straight black saxophone, soprano saxophone, which is very much like a clarinet, but sounds totally different. And so I started playing in sax quartets and then eventually big bands and stuff at school. So that was my beginnings, an attempt to be cool, because let's be honest, it is cool.
It is. Also, I forgot to mention, I used to play trombone, but I was never very good at it. So,
Yes! Yay, trombone!
Did you used to play trombone? Well, Kathy, you were just overjoyed, so I'm going to come to you to ask you about your intro to jazz.
Well, mine is very much the same as Sam mentioned. I was in band since third grade, and I started out on tuba. And I got the chance to listen to the jazz band play over the years, and I really, really, really wanted to play with the jazz band because they sounded cool.
Yeah.
But there wasn't a lot for the tuba to do other than follow the string bass line, so eventually I started learning to play bass trombone as well, just so I had something to actually do in the jazz band, and just kind of, enjoyed my time there while they let me. It was nice.
Aww. And Callum, how about you?
So, I'm not actually sure if I remember, but I know how I got into some of the jazz genres that particularly piqued my interest, and that was through picking up some new instruments and kind of wanting to see what was played with those instruments. So, like, in particular, I assume because it was cheap and seemed interesting, I got a tin whistle. And it turns out tin whistle is a very iconic jazz instrument, quite an influential jazz instrument. So that was kind of one. And I was also, I decided to get a ukulele because I guess it was cool to get ukuleles at that time when I was about 13.
Yeah, I remember the ukulele craze.
Ukulele jazz is a thing, and that's a very unique and interesting sound. And plucking ukulele is great too.
Beth pointing to her ukulele there.
It's very, not to go on too much of a tangent, but to me, I was always drawn with the ukulele to not strum and to sort of like pluck at it, because maybe it's just because with hands the size of my hands, you can kind of you have the whole neck of ukulele pretty much covered. It doesn't take the stretching the hand out skill. When I have quite stubby fingers for a multi-instrumentalist, to be fair, than a guitar, and it was kind of just an excuse to do more of that. But I guess when you kind of play something, you try to then understand it a bit more, and I guess you sort of, I don't know, I feel like that was my journey into it, was being like looking for pieces of music to play, and then inevitably you hear them because you're trying to play them and understand them, and you can't help but become interested through osmosis, I guess.
So what I'm hearing is that all of us in some way have played a jazz instrument or can sing in a jazzy style, because that's what I'm a much better singer than I was a trombonist.
I'm the same. I'm a singer more than anything else. So.
We could start a jazz band.
Yeah.
We should.
We actually could. I'll file that away for later consideration.
I feel like we should, on this call,
I was going to say, Callum, there's some instruments lying around. I mean, why wait?
Yeah.
Let's just get on with it.
I know, we need to rewind back. This has already came up, and it's clearly fate that we should be playing today. By Skype. Let's do a very experimental enthusiasm, and we don't talk, we just riff off each other for an hour, and then that's it.
Talk with our instruments. Yeah.
I mean, Enthusiasm's an excellent name for a jazz band as well. It's brilliant.
It is.
True.
Oh my gosh, I'd never noticed that. Yeah, it is a good band name. Aren't I smart? Excellent.
I hope the marketing department did the due diligence and got that one like trademarked down. I wonder whose responsibility that kind of thing might have been.
I mean, I don't think I've said it on a podcast yet, but Enthusiasm was actually a joke title. I was like, we could call it this, this, and this, or we could always call it Enthusiasm. And Alex was like, yes. I am going to segue into the question I wrote down later, which is like, what is your favorite instrument to hear in like jazz? Or do you think that it's all about like the whole, or because there's always a section in most jazz songs where each player gets to do their own little thing for a while, gets a little solo in which they can just go, you know, ba-da-ba-ba-da-ba-la-ba-ba, or whatever, you know? Mm-hmm. Do we have any opinions on this?
Yeah, I kind of do, but it's not a satisfactory one. I think it's that it depends on the player. I think it really depends on the player and context as well. I think the best players make the best solos, and so in that sense, I don't really have a favorite instrument. I mean, I'm going back to my fusiony thing here. I was listening to a bit of Snarky Puppy earlier, and like there's this Corey Henry solo on synths, and it's just mind blowing. And yet another, more trad jazz kind of thing on trumpet is also amazing. So yeah, I don't know. I don't really have. Although when you said trombone, something happened in my heart. I was like, oh, there's nothing better than a trombone solo. But
Really?
Yeah.
The trombone solos are awesome. They're so good.
Why is that? Why do you think a trombone is great?
For me, it's like the idea of this agile, virtuosic solo being on a trombone as an orchestrator. That's just something that doesn't happen. And yet it happens all the time in jazz, and it's always great because I think it's got a particular sound because it's so difficult to do as well. It's not like everything's at your fingertips, as it were. You've really got to make something of the mechanics of the instrument to make it work. And I think that really lends itself to something interesting, worth listening to. That's my opinion on that.
Well, that's what makes it brilliant, though, too, is the fact that the trombone, you're not tied into valves. You're not tied into keys. You've got a slide, and all you're doing is you're just moving that slide back and forth. You've got all of the notes, basically, to choose from, which, like, really opens it up expressively in an expressive way, which is, like, a core part of jazz. I don't know, just jumping off what you said there. Yeah, it's fun having trombone in jazz all the time.
Yeah.
I really love clarinet, though, Sam, even though you said it wasn't cool. I love clarinet.
Well, see, it's interesting. Before I started saxophone, I wasn't even really aware of clarinet as in jazz. I mean, I was quite young.
Jazz, yeah.
I was quite young, but like, and I guess I'd played some sort of Dixieland style things without really being aware that that's also jazz and also cool. Yeah, no, I just wanted to. I think it was honestly the image,
Yeah.
The image of holding a saxophone is just so much cooler. But I know exactly what you mean. Clarinets are awesome. I'm not dissing clarinets at all. My first love.
Yeah, I think they're really nice because, in jazz, there's so many kind of metally sounding instruments. Not as in metal rock hands, you can't hear that. But, I think it's got it's just softer, isn't it? Warmer than a lot of the other instruments. So sometimes it's nice to have that different edge.
It's also, again, getting sort of boring orchestration-y on it, but there's a lot more variation in the sound of a clarinet from bottom to top than a saxophone. Saxophones are fairly homogeneous in their timbre. There you go. But yeah, the clarinet has a lot more variation. It can be really, really cool.
Callum, what are your opinions on best instrument to listen to?
That is a good question. So I've already mentioned the tin whistle. Now, I find that an extremely interesting instrument. I've also already mentioned flute. So I like jazz flute, and I guess tin whistle jazz kind of like leans a little bit into what flutes do. However, with a very unique sound characteristic that at times can be, to be honest, completely obnoxious and really quite rough, particularly since a lot of recordings that were done with tin whistle in the genre of Quayle jazz were very like rough, shorn stuff done in people's homes and things like that. So there's like some imperfections to it that kind of like endear you to it and kind of can be challenging on the ear, which makes it almost all the more rewarding a genre to get into. But then on the other side of things, I think that one of the things that sort of makes jazz is the fact that you're not necessarily bound to an individual instrument.
Yeah.
And doing lots of different stuff with lots of different instruments. And a genre that I'm really into, exotica, is actually almost like the genre of just recycling other people's compositions on other instruments. I think that, yes, there's one particular instrument that I like, but jazz is kind of defined by people trying to play different types of songs or like existing methods or sounds on new instruments and just taking it and transposing it for like their band and what instruments they use.
Yeah. See, I'm almost completely the opposite opinion in that my favorite instrument to hear when I'm listening to jazz is the trumpet, which for me, I think is just the classic jazz instrument. I cannot think of trumpets without thinking of jazz and vice versa. And that's probably really influenced from my dad's taste. He was very into the very brassy sounding artists, very much Count Basie kind of dude. I wanted to go back briefly. Sam, you mentioned Dixieland. Should we just clarify what that is for the audience?
On the spot, Helen. Thank you.
It's okay. No, if anyone else wants to define it, we can share the burden.
The earliest sort of parts of jazz come from a combination of early blues and marching music. And Dixieland was a sort of offset of that, which ended up kind of. So we're talking sort of the deep south of the States here, where it became a bit more of a thing you sat and listened to, rather than, it started to become its own thing. That's when jazz started to form, and Dixieland is pretty much one of the earliest forms of jazz as we might understand it now, when it's not like marching bands combined with that kind of blues culture. That's my understanding of what Dixieland is. And so I think that's probably the reason why it's a clarinet, not a saxophone, is that clarinet has been around much longer. Because the saxophone's only, I think early 19th century, mid-19th century invention. But yeah, that's my understanding of it. Anyone else know better?
It's a very tangential and a very complex music history, not just for Dixie, but all of like jazz, really. I mean, we're talking, we got the brass bands, like Sam said. We've got blues, ragtime, syncopated dance bands, all happening in the same era of like pre-World War One. All just started happening all at the same time. So it's really hard to pinpoint all of the different characteristics. But to what Sam was saying, with Dixie, these brass bands were especially popular down in New Orleans, New Orleans, however the listener wants to interpret it. And they started doing competitions back and forth in the streets. They were so popular and so good, they started playing at each other. And it kind of led into the style of music competition, of riffing off each other, trying to one-up each other. And now if you go down to listen to, like, Dixie in New Orleans, you can kind of see where that has evolved into, like, the bands playing in the street or at Mardi Gras doing music back and forth. Sorry, I think I ran off with your topic there, but it's just so cool how music, like, actively evolves all the time. I can't stop talking about it.
Well, you're right. I'd agree, because in sort of modern history of music, jazz has been something of a core of that. And you can see that thread through almost all music we listen to now. And that's the thing that's so interesting to me about jazz, is that it really has fed into everything in the last 100, 150 years.
Yeah.
And yeah, that just being an early example, but these styles were so kind of incestuous around that time, around the turn of the century. But yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting.
There's also like a lot of parallel development and then like, I guess, cross-pollination going on with jazz as well between what was happening in New Orleans and in like Johannesburg in South Africa. And what was really interesting, or at least to me personally, is they both developed scenes of playing very early kind of proto-jazz music in and around the late 1910s and 1920s. And in both cases, it was influenced by marching bands. in Johannesburg, they had the Scottishes, that was the very Scottish regiment. And then in New Orleans, they had marching bands as well. And then what seemed to happen is that artists would travel across the world and play in other cities, and records would be traded. Often improvised records and stuff would be traded, and they would kind of cross-pollinate with each other, or arguably something in the DNA of that marching band music took just a natural progression that sort of developed over time in similar ways. So either there was cross-pollination, which is assumed, but then there's also the potential that the jazz almost took the same path in two different parts of the world at the same time. And I kind of find that quite fascinating, the way that jazz is built and the way that it's crossed into so many things. And when it exploded in global popularity, it just sort of went, oh, what's happening musically in this country? We're going to have some of that, and we're going to create a hybrid genre over here. I feel like it's almost present on this call, because we probably all have very different tastes and interests in jazz too, because it's it's a super topic as big as let's just talk about books.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm very aware how many different genres and subgenres of jazz are, because I really like a really good vocalist in general. In my taste in music, I like a vocalist who, when I hear them, I'm like, yes, that is so and so. It could not be anyone else. So when I hear Billie Holiday or
She's my favorite,
Louis Armstrong,
and that's my second favorite.
I'm sensing, Beth, that you and I have similar tastes.
Yeah.
When I hear them, I'm like, yes, that is them. And I like to be able to recognize people straight away in that way.
Yes. And I think jazz allows for that in instruments and vocals, in that it allows so much freedom compared to many. Before that, I mean, no, not really before that, because then people were improvising. But when everything started to become written down more so, it felt like there wasn't as much improvisation, and jazz allows this freedom to just do what you like, to sound like you like, to make crazy noises and it be absolutely fine. It's just part of it. And just express yourself in the way that's most authentic to you. And it doesn't matter if you're playing bass or you're singing, but that's what's lovely about it.
Yeah.
And there's not, I don't feel like there's genres for me that really embodies that feeling of freedom in the same way. Or certainly, if there is, a lot of it has been influenced by jazz.
Yeah. I really wish that I knew a lot more about jazz history now, because I'm thinking very much about how it's rooted in Black history, particularly.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And gospel music.
And about the freedom of the way that jazz sounds and the way that you're allowed to be, how that is potentially linked to the oppression that Black people at the time who were inventing all of this stuff, to that coming out. Because I know that when I'm feeling really shit, I tend to get more creative. So I can only imagine. And it also makes me think of how, you were mentioning how different jazz bands would be competing. And my mind immediately went to, rap battles that people would be doing, 60, 70 years later. The constant invention, I think, is something that is often very much rooted in Black culture.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I was just going to say, we mentioned, I think I mentioned earlier, the sort of blues culture, which obviously stems from slavery and is singing in the fields. And that influence I think that's kind of the crux of it, because every culture in the world has what's called a pentatonic scale. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you'll hear this. Is it worth me playing on the piano?
Yes, please do. Please do.
But only just the scale. Okay. But what blues brought is this, there's this anguish in the sound which created the blues note. And that fed into everything. And I think that just that spirit of freedom, right? There's no other word for it really. And just bringing some freedom into the music that's really kind of fed into all of jazz, I think. Even just something as simple as that. Take any other culture, pentatonic scales are everywhere, but no one's kind of done that. And it's something so simple, but you can kind of hear that pain in that, what you were saying, Helen, and absolutely, I think that's really just seeped into all types of jazz. That's how it all kind of started from my point of view, is just that change.
Yeah.
Is that it needed that extra something when they were all singing together. Yeah.
That little clash is the clash against the rest of the chords that just makes it feel kind of, I don't want to say uneasy. It's like defiant in its own way.
Yeah.
Like it's defiantly like, I'm going to sit just off the rest of this chord.
Yeah.
And then it actually just sounds wicked.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And that's very much the spirit of slave songs being sung and being played out on plantation and off plantation, the work songs, the spiritual songs, all of those. I mean, it was all about something, a form of expression that couldn't be controlled.
The way that I would put it is that, like, the mere fact of finding creative joy, that is in itself the defiance. It's I am going to find my joy and find happiness in this thing that you cannot take away from me. And that to me is very powerful. On that, I think we're going to take a little break, and then we'll come back and we'll talk a bit more about jazz. And welcome back. So, let's get into some specifics. Does anyone have like a favorite jazz musician or singer? Because Beth, you mentioned Billie Holiday earlier. Do you want to talk a bit more about her?
I just feel like she is someone who isn't perfect in many ways, but is very creative, and she takes a lot of the imperfections, especially within her voice as she got older. She takes them and makes it into something that is really emotional, that really like makes the audience feel something.
Yeah.
So whether it's the cracks or the breaks in her voice or the way that she definitely had vocal damage by the end of her life, but rather than kind of shying away from anything, she fully embodied that. And I mean, I don't know if anyone has seen, again, that recent movie. There's Lady Sing the Blues, but there's the new one that's just come out with Andra Day. So it has a bit more about the history, but her whole life is incredible about civil rights and, of course, Strange Fruit. And that is a really important song. And it's a really, like, visceral song. Like, I feel it's horrible to even think about the words of those songs. But the bravery that she has is fantastic. I love her.
Yeah. That thing you said about imperfections in someone's voice, that's one of the things that I love in a vocalist. I would much rather listen to someone distinguishable but not always perfect than someone who was completely note perfect but could be anybody.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the same with Nina Simone, because no, she's not the best singer in the world, but I love the passion. I love like the sound of her voice. Like, she's got a very specific power. She has massive power in her voice. I guess that's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
I saw her do a cover of a song called Feelings. I can't remember the name of the guy who wrote it first. I think it was like Morris something. Anyway, I highly recommend that. If you look up Nina Simone Feelings, that's an excellent demonstration of what I mean. Any other favourites from anyone else?
So I really like Quailer jazz music, and in particular, I really like Spokes Machine.
Very quickly, Callum, what's Quailer jazz music?
So Quailer jazz music is a very particular type of jazz from South Africa. I guess it specifically is a genre that's often played on tin whistle / penny whistle, or occasionally through solo on the saxophone. It's really about repetition of 2 to 4 bar patterns throughout.
Yeah.
It was one of the first musical progressions in jazz in South Africa to sort of move more towards a swingish type of drum beat, whereas before that it had often been quite sort of straight and driving, really sort of drawing on those, on the influence of marching bands. And at the point of Quailer, it sort of like spun off a little bit more in the swing direction. but it's basically just a particular subgenre of South African jazz music. Spokes Machine, in particular, is an artist who was quite influential within that space and actually managed to get some sort of global acknowledgement for the music that they were playing on the penny whistle. And then as someone who took this genre and then began to introduce the saxophone as well. Its influence actually on other jazz progression and stuff like kind of can't be overlooked, particularly Spokes Machine. I think also like the best sort of route into listening to the genre would be to listen to Spokes Machine.
Kathy, any favourites from you?
Oh gosh. As the person who can't really keep a catalog of famous artists in her head, no, I like it all. It's great. It really is.
That's fine.
The funny thing about jazz is, I mean, it's all about expression, right? So you're just hearing everybody's different types of expressions, and it's just all about kind of what resonates with you in the moment. And every some days where, like, Louis Armstrong is, a big popular one. I love Louis as well. There's some days I love to listen to him belting out a tune or, like, singing Mac the Knife or something like that. And then other days where I just can't get into it because my mental or emotional state isn't there. But I mean, that's because that's what's like a lot of other music too. It resonates with you emotionally, and because there's so much expression and meaning behind it as a music form, it can be all over the place.
Yeah.
One artist that recently came back into my sphere is Sam Palafian. He is a jazz tuba player, and starting to listen to some of his stuff, the amount of technicality and flexibility he does on the tuba going into all these different classic jazz songs is just beautiful. I mean, after a while you forget you're listening to a tuba and it's just you're listening to someone's deep soul just kind of coming out through the instrument. It's great.
I love that. You mentioned Louis Armstrong, which reminded me, has anyone heard Louis Jordan?
No.
Gosh, I think Louis Jordan and his Timpani Five. So they did so many songs that I know really well now. Like he did this song called Is You Is or Is You Ain't My Baby. And there's this one song called Five Guys Named Mo. Does anyone know that song?
It sounds familiar. I wish I remembered the tune.
It goes like, there's Big Mo, Uliada, itty bitty Mo, Uliada, four-eyed Mo, Uliada, no Mo, Uliada, look them brothers, like that.
I love it though.
It sounds great.
Does anyone recognize? Oh, I'm the only person who knows about Louis Jordan.
I wish I knew that song.
He's got so many. A lot of them are really funny. There's one song, I think it's called Chartreuse, and it's just like, you've dyed your hair chartreuse. I'm going to go and tell your mum. There's one called Saturday Night Fish Fry, which is just about the fish bar down the road. And there's so much fun in his songs and in his music. And then he's got a couple of... They're funny. They're really funny lyrics a lot of the time. And then some of them are kind of bluesy and romantic. Like the one I mentioned... Is you is or is you ain't my baby. And then there's like this piano goes ba-la-ba-ba, ba-la-ba-ba-ba. Anyway, that's a recommendation for you. I just wanted to mention the other Louis that's in my mind. Sam, give us your favourites.
I just have to point out the amazing hand motions you were doing there, Helen.
This is how you play piano, right?
Superb. It was great. Yeah, I mean, kind of like Kathy, I'm a bit of a fickle listener, to be honest. It's kind of mood dependent. And, you know, the purists are going to roll their eyes and cross their arms. But I definitely, the stuff I listen to most tends to branch from funk. Mm-hmm. I just love funk music. And I know we've talked a lot about the kind of the freedom of jazz, and that's the sort of important factor. And I think a lot of purists are like, well, funk kind of takes a bit of that away. But I do listen to a lot of like Snarky Puppy and Wolfpack and things like that. I just find that super cool, and they're always so like tight as an ensemble. There's something really satisfying about that as well. Again, it's kind of very sort of different to trad jazz, but I do have a lot of appreciation for Jacob Collier.
Yes.
For those that know him, he's a lot of people don't like him because he overcomplicates something that's not quite jazz a lot of the time. But the guy's a genius. He's a genuine prodigy. The thing that he does, I think, that's really nice is that he makes a lot of the ideas of like jazz harmony and the complexities therein, but it's also about not just sticking to a lot of like pop sensibilities. It's like he's really freeing in the way he uses harmony, and yet it's somewhat accessible as well. So yeah, I do really appreciate what he does for the music community. But yeah, in terms of like classics, let's say, I love Coltrane as a saxophonist. Yeah, he's up there. I'd say that's the standout for me, probably. Although I never listened to it, I remember, because I remember having to write an essay on it, of Ornette Coleman, and just finding the fact that he made this free jazz album on like a plastic trumpet, and just kind of hilarious and awesome. Yeah, and they were about the same time. It all happened, is it 59, where a load of jazz albums came out, and it's kind of like Miles Davis and kind of Blue. All those kinds of albums all happened around the late 50s, I think. And he was one of them that things started to branch off and weird things happened. Yeah, it was all very interesting.
What does a plastic trumpet sound like? Does it sound different?
Not as good as a metal one.
Yes.
I think he was like entirely self-taught as well. He had, same with saxophone. But yeah, he was a multi-instrumentalist, kind of did everything. But yeah, it sounds like a plastic trumpet.
That also reminds me of an anecdote my dad once told me. I don't know if any of you know this one, about there was one jazz musician who something happened to his trumpet and like he dropped it or something, and it had like a massive like dent in it.
It's Dizzy Gillespie.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
yeah,
that's the one.
It was like that, and he carried on playing with it. Yeah.
Yes, and it gave him like a really unique sound.
Yeah, he's the guy that played with big puffed out cheeks as well. He looked really funny when he was playing, but he was awesome too. Dizzy Gillespie. Yeah, that's on there. That's on the list.
Yeah. I'm looking up now. Oh, yeah, I know him. Okay, we're going to move on to our last question, which is, where would you recommend people new to the genre to start? Like, what do you think is a good introductory artist to listen to?
If you want something that's like crossover, everyone's going to be like, because it's not really jazz. But if you want something, I was going to say postmodern jukebox or something like that. If you're not into jazz at all, something that takes any other genre and adds a jazz twist is kind of a good gateway jazz thing.
Yeah.
Or even like the Lady Gaga, Tony Bennett things. And Tony Bennett does a whole series of, I love them, of like jazz songs with like Lady Gaga, Amy Winehouse. There's like a whole bunch on there. They're really great.
I've never heard of this. What is this?
It's just on his YouTube channel. He's got like, I guess he just released them on YouTube. And maybe he released it as an album as well, I'm not sure. But the Lady Gaga and Tony Bennett, Lady is a Tramp, is really beautiful and really, they're really great together. And she has really cool blue hair.
Any other recommendations?
I mean, not to sound like a one-track record here, but I mean, funk's a pretty good way to get into jazz.
Yeah.
I think, that might be a good start. Or like, just kind of looking into Quincy Jones stuff, like really good arrangers, I find pretty appealing. There's another guy whose name's gone out of my head completely, but used to do all of the sort of bigger band arrangements in like the 40s, 50s. Those kinds of things, like the stuff that Frank Sinatra would sing over, that stuff, they're really good ways to get in, I think.
I mean, you can't go wrong with Wynton Marsalis.
Yeah.
If you like a trumpet, it's always there, and there's a big catalog to pull from as far as like listening. I'm gonna say something that's probably gets poo-pooed on by purists, but some anime jazz is actually really freaking awesome. I mean, I'm thinking like Cowboy Bebop. If you listen to that intro track, just like the bass line that gets laid down over the main theme is just beautiful. And there's a surprising amount of jazz musicality in some animes. And, if that's your thing, go find out where those instrumentalists and those musicians and composers are and start listening to those work and figure out where they got their inspiration from and then go listen to that. Yeah, it's really all finding something that resonates with you and then go backwards from there.
And what about you, Callum?
So, I just basically talked about how great Exotica was. I feel like because that is literally an easy listening genre, is like its classification thing that people like to give. I would say anything by Les Baxter, really extensive back catalogue. You can just put it on in the background. It's not going to like overcomplicate things, but it's gonna be quite relaxing, good to listen to. When I was talking about favourite musicians before, I totally left off Herbie Mann. Really, really extensive back catalogue of music. Played a lot of very interesting flute, like one of the great jazz flute players. Very known for popularising bossa nova music, as well as I guess a lot of like the Afro-Cuban sound and stuff. He did a lot with that and sort of popularising that as well. So I would definitely start with Herbie Mann and Les Baxter. And I mentioned Spokes Machine before, and I feel like if you want to know a little bit about the less discussed roots of jazz music, I think I would look at the Quayle Jazz of Spokes Machine.
Cool. I think what I would recommend is probably, I think technically it's a swing song, I guess, since it's in the title, but it don't mean a thing if you ain't got that swing. Just because that has both Ella Fitzgerald and Duke Ellington in it. And it's so good. I love that song. Also, it sticks with you. Like, it's now in my head for the rest of the day.
Yeah, I'm literally swaying to it in my head right now.
Do I.
I have one more controversial pick. Ooh. And I would say that maybe like a lot of people would not have trouble leaping from an interest in rock or indie music into Go-Go Penguin.
Oh, I don't know them.
I feel like they have some sort of jazz elements that I think that if you already like those things, you're not going to have a problem with Go-Go Penguin, and then you can be like, okay, so I've sort of conquered the genre, and then you could move on to something that's a little bit more traditionally jazz.
Although I feel like we are making it sound like jazz is a genre that you're like, you have to go soft. But actually, like, you can listen, it's like a lot of, you can just listen to jazz. Yeah. Like, we're trying to scoot around it. There is lots of, just go listen to like Ella Fitzgerald or like any of the classics and they're there.
Yeah. God, just took some Miles Davis in there. It'd be great.
Yeah.
Okay. So with all of those recommendations that I hope you listeners have taken note of, I think we're going to close this episode out. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you've had fun, just like we have, especially since jazz is all about having fun. But for now, it's goodbye from me, goodbye, and it's goodbye from everyone else. Do you want to say goodbye, everybody?
Goodbye.
Enthusiasm is a podcast distributed by Rusty Quill and licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike 4.0 international license. It is directed by Helen Gould, produced by Lowry Ann Davis, with executive producers Alexander J. Newell and April Sumner, and edited by Marissa Ewing, Tessa Vroom, Jeffrey Nils Gardner, and Catherine Ranella. Thanks for listening.